I want to go through most of the Photoshop brush settings. To get started, I have my brush tool selected here. I'm going to go up here. This is the options for the brush tool. I want to go in here and select a brush from these presets. And I'm going to look for a basic round brush. Now the taper on this shows that the size of the brush is being controlled by the pressure of my Wacom tablet. I'm going to select that. Go over here, you see a light touch, thin line. As I bear down more, I can get a fatter line. If I go back in here, you can see that with this current brush selection, I can change the size here, and I can change the hardness. Let me make this well, let me leave the size alone, but here you see a softer brush. And a more medium brush. I can also change the roundness of the brush and the angle of the brush tip. So if you're doing more of a calligraphic type thing, you can play with that. So when I go back in, you see that my previous brush settings are remembered here. So if I want to go back to the round one or like the hard round one, I can just select it there. Now, to see the other brush settings, because this is just a few of the basic settings that you have control of with the built-in round brush. I'm going to now click on the brush settings, and this brings up a panel for all the settings for the currently selected brush. Here you can see the brush tip. The default size is 30 pixels, so if I use the mouse that does not have brush weight, actually I have it disconnected. Okay. But if I turn off pressure sensitivity and click with my stylus, that is the 30 pixel default size of the brush tip. I'm going to turn pressure sensitivity back on, and you see the sample brush stroke here changes. This shows there's no pressure sensitivity. This shows there is. So looking at the other settings, we already looked at the roundness and angle. It's available here too. There's the softness. Spacing is something available here. So a brush stroke is composed of individual applications of the brush tip. When it's spaced out like this, and let me go back around. If I have it like this and set the spacing to like 100, you see that I can draw a string of dots, basically touching. I have about an extra 4% there. Turn pressure back on. To get an idea of what some of these other settings do, I want to look at some other presets. In here in the brush tips, you see that there are the round ones. Then there are these bristle brushes, which work in a different way, where you control the bristle length, thickness, stiffness, and angle. There are also these erodible tips where you might start with a pointy tip stylus, and the more you use it, the more it gets worn down, and you have a kind of rounded tip, and you can go in here and sharpen it again. I don't use these a whole lot. With different other settings, you can see some of the effects better. There's also an airbrush here where you control like the splatter, things like that. If I go farther down here, you see custom brushes made for the dynamic brush engine that start with a shape. So here we see like this basic leaf shape. Draw it across. And you see with that spacing, we just have this leaf. And I lost my pressure control again. There's a brush based on the leaf we were looking at before, but now it's acting differently. It's scattered, different sizes, different rotations. And if I flip over here to having a color, you can see the transparency there. And actually, if I go to the scattered maple leaves, you'll see that it's actually varying the hue of the brush as it's being applied. So there are a lot of different things you can control, and it's kind of fun just to pick one of these and then go into the brush settings and see what's turned on. You can see shape dynamics, there's pen pressure control, there's also pen pressure control of the angle of the of rotation, there's scattering, there's color dynamics where you have hue jitter. Whenever you see the word hue, they're talking about randomization. Here the hue isn't a particular color, it's the foreground color, but with some randomness added to it. So that's hue jitter, and there's all kinds of jitter in here. I'm going to create a custom brush tip. Now to do that, let me see, my opacity is set to 75%. One thing about these brush tips is that they're shades of gray, where it's completely black, that's full application of the color, full opacity essentially. Where it's completely white, it'll be more transparent. So I'm going to start with a line. I want to make this a little asymmetrical. Now because of the opacity, where they overlap, I'm getting a darker color, and we're going to see that come into play. I'm going to also put some lighter bits on here. I don't really have a plan, I'm just having fun. Okay, so let's say that this is our brush tip. Now I have a selection for the whole page here, but if I deselect and create a selection just around this, I can define that as a pattern. Edit, define pattern. If this were something I was really using, I'd give it a more distinct name. Then I'm going to deselect and create a brush preset. And now we see it's like a white on gray image, like our other brush shapes. And you should give it a good name. I'm just going to click OK here. Now before I forget, I am going to select all, have everything selected here. And now with the brush at 100% opacity, and I just click, I get something that looks exactly like what I had before. Okay, I have my fingers crossed. Unusual technical issues. I restarted because the pressure sensitivity of my tablet was not working in Photoshop. When I restarted my computer, it was working fine, and I recorded the whole demo, and the recording software failed to record what I was saying. So let's take another stab at this. It's getting to be a long day here. We defined a brush shape. If I go in here and click, oh, okay, pressure sensitivity, I clicked and I got a little version. If I turn off pressure sensitivity and click, I should get something that is exactly like what I drew. And if I stroke, Here's the sample brushstroke here. Depending on the direction I'm going, I might get different results. I'm going to clear all of that. And I'm going to turn pressure sensitivity back on, and it's displaying it here. So, yay, that's good. As if it's actually recording my voice, that's even better. Let's look at some of the settings here. I'm going to switch from black to a color. The default behavior is for the brush to display the foreground color with, where it's black, you get 100% of the foreground color. Where it's white, you get 0% of the foreground color. And where it's gray, you get a shade of the foreground color. Going into the brush settings. Okay, here's the brush shape. We can control the spacing. We can control the rotation of the shape. So you get a very different kind of effect with something like that versus something like that. You can also change the roundness, which gives you a compressed brush shape. I'm going to widen that back out. So there's the angle that the brush shape is displayed at. There's the roundness of it. There's the spacing. These are some of your basic shape controls. Alright, so let's take a look at some of the other controls. Shape dynamics. That's in play. I turned on pressure sensitivity here. If I go into shape dynamics, you see that size, which is in this section, is controlled by pen pressure. Depending on how hard I press, I get different size. Now, there are some other options here. If you look at the sample brushstroke here, there's jitter. Whenever you see the word jitter, it means randomness. So you can randomize the size of the brush tip being displayed. If I increase that, you see the size randomly changing. And as I stroke, there's still pen pressure control, but within that, there's some randomization going on. Now you can, well, let me take that off. You can also have minimum diameter. So it goes from like a point to 100% to a point. If you change the minimum, you can say, well, okay, I want pen pressure control, but I never want it to go below like 56% here. So it kind of limits the range of the size. So for size, there's pen pressure control, and then there's also randomness. Size, angle, roundness. So for angle, you can randomize that so that as you draw, the angle of the brush tip is like rotated random angles. So that's appropriate for a lot of things. You can also control angle based on pen pressure and all these other things. So if I stroke like this and press down harder, suddenly it's flipping over. Let me try going this direction, pressing down harder. And this makes a little more sense to me. It's like here, the harder I press, the more it's rotating over, which is something you might actually want to do. So pen pressure control over the angle, or just randomly changing it. Roundness is something that also can be controlled by pen pressure or randomness. This looks very similar to size change, except it's only happening on the one axis of the brush shape. Okay, so I'm going to take that off. So that's shape dynamics. Size, angle, roundness. Those are the same things we have control of here. It just is that we have the ability to control it with things like pen pressure and the ability to randomize it. Let's look at scattering. I didn't know Photoshop was so buggy. Okay, under scatter, you can increase the scatter and the brush tips will go away from the path of the stroke perpendicularly. If you select both axes, they'll scatter vertically and horizontally away from the path. So let's crank that up, paint it. Now, so it's scattered, but they're all oriented the same way. So that's something to look at here. The other thing you can control is the count. Basically, if you scatter things, sometimes you want to increase the occurrences so you don't have to work so hard filling stuff in. Because they're spread out, you want more of them. That's controlled by count, and you can randomize that with count jitter. Okay, so scattering often goes hand in hand with angle jitter. Crank that all the way up, go in here. And now you have the spatial scattering together with the angle jitter or rotation randomization. Okay, so those often go together. For now, I'm going to skip over texture and dual brush because that doesn't kind of play in here so much, but let's go to color dynamics and take a look at something. So we have this blue color here, bleed everything. And, well, there's foreground, background jitter. Okay, our background color is black. So here we have our foreground color randomly mixed with black to create these different shades. A more common thing is probably to have like a couple different colors, like foreground color, blue, green, and here we have some randomization between the foreground color and the background color. I mean, it's similar to, but different from hue jitter. Hue jitter just looks at the foreground color, here blue, and varies it to a certain extent. So, this is a normal stroke, it's just the foreground color. If we increase the hue jitter, well, let's do it just a little bit at first. Just a little bit of hue jitter, and you see a little bit of variation there. Increase it a little bit more, you see some other hues coming in. If we crank it all the way up, it's just all the hues available. Let's take that out. Saturation jitter. Okay, so just normal brush stroke. Saturation jitter. You see you have gray to saturated blue. Brightness jitter. You would get the foreground color mixed with different brightnesses, brighter and darker. Clear. So purity is kind of weird. So this is everything normal. If I bring that down halfway, you see it's taken out saturation. things are becoming gray. Alright. Go back to 0. And start bringing it up. In this case, we don't see much change, but it's basically going more saturated here. So maybe if I selected that color, put this at 0. So we have this light blue. As I increase purity, it's actually creating more saturated versions of that. So at first I started with something that was already pretty saturated, so there's nowhere to go from there. Back here to 0. Bring it down, and it's getting less and less saturated. So there's normal saturation, you're taking saturation out, or you're adding saturation. That's purity. Okay, so that's color dynamics. All right, so looking at the rest of these, okay, I'll go into texture and dual brush a little bit. There are these menu items where there are a lot of choices, and then down here there are things that are just check boxes. Like right now, smoothing is on, so it smooths out your brush strokes. There are things like white edge, noise, and these things aren't demonstrated with this brush as well, neither with this. So I'm going to switch to a different brush here, just to touch on those things a little bit. Okay, so here is a brush. I'm going to make it a little smaller and maybe a little darker here, show up a little better. Okay, so looking at this, texture and dual brush are similar in that, you know, you have a brush shape, but within that shape you're displaying a texture. So if I select this texture, it's displaying this texture within that brush shape, but these things are all very dependent on all of these different factors here. So it's like, you know, you can scale things up. Looking at the sample brush stroke here, not seeing much. It's very common not to see anything here until you have everything set up. Let me try a different texture, see what we can get here. Multiply? No. Height. Okay, so here with height at particular depth, we start seeing some things show up here. So the idea is my brush is a round brush, and I have pressure sensitivity. But within that, rather than just getting our foreground color, we're getting a texture. Okay, so all of these settings really affect, you know, what you get. And sometimes it looks like you're getting nothing. Okay, but so two things. There's the brush stroke based on your brush tip and all your other settings, but it's filled with the texture. Dual brush is really similar, except instead of, let me take the texture off, except that instead of being filled with the texture, it's filled with another brush. So I'm going to select one of these textures here. Color burn probably isn't going to work for this. Let me try multiply. Okay, so as I brush, this brush is one that I created Here's the one that we just made. Okay, so here's the brush we made, or you saw me make. And I have my round brush, and within that brush stroke it's displaying a pattern based on this brush tip made here. So texture and dual brush are very similar, except one is displaying a pattern that's defined within the brush stroke, and this is displaying another brush inside the brush stroke. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off. Now we just have our brush. Other things here, a lot of on-off things. Noise, just add some noise. Wet edges is worth mentioning here. The idea of wet edges is like you're doing watercolor. And I'm going to zoom in for this one so you can see a little bit better. You'll see that when I turn wet edges off, I just have my foreground color. When I turn it on, the pigment within the brushstroke migrates towards the edge of the stroke. I don't know if you've seen this in watercolors, but you know, it's watery. The pigments will kind of float to the edge and land there, and that's what they're trying to simulate here. Okay, so those are the settings that I wanted to be sure everyone knew about, and I'm going to try to do a demo showing an application of creating brushes for specific purposes.